everyone. As PJ mentioned, I'm Parisa, and I'm so thankful to be here. I also want to mention that it is my final year at UBC, and I'll be graduating. Yes, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I'll be going over some of the work I've been doing with CGC and this particular paper that looks at barriers to accessing mental health care services among women living with HIV here in the Metro Vancouver area. Before we get right into it, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that I have had both the honor and privilege of studying and working on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of the topics that this paper touched on, which is the inability to access healthcare services, is a result of the colonial impacts that have impacted our healthcare institutions. And it's so important to talk about these issues and address these issues as we continue to collaborate and work with the communities that we do. Okay, so to provide a little bit of background on this paper, mental health impacts everyone, regardless of their age, their race, or any other socio-demographic characteristics. And this particular paper that I have cited looked at how the prevalence of mental health has increased since 1999 until 2019 by almost 50%. So mental health impacts everyone across the world. However, there is literature to suggest that people living with HIV experience higher levels of mental health conditions. And there's also literature to suggest that women living with HIV experience higher prevalences of mental health conditions compared to men living with HIV. To add on to that burden, there is literature to suggest that women living with HIV also go through a lot of social and structural barriers, such as food insecurity, substance use, HIV-related stigma, as well as gender-based violence. And it's a combination of those things which impact both HIV-related health outcomes and access to mental health care and other health-related services. However, not a lot of papers have looked at what are the barriers to mental health care services, especially among women living with HIV. So the objective of this paper was to examine the social, systemic, and structural factors associated with being unable to access mental health care services. To provide a little bit about the cohort, as Mika mentioned, we do draw data from the SHAWNA cohort, which is the longitudinal community-based open cohort consisting of cis and trans women living with HIV over the age of 14. Our participants do come from a broad range of backgrounds. However, the other eligibility criteria is that they either live or at least access their healthcare services here in the Metro Vancouver area. So our primary outcome variable was whether or not participants responded yes or no to needing or wanting additional mental health care services and being unable to access it in the last 6 months. And if you look at the left side, those are just some of the explanatory variables that we looked at. And for brevity, and because I could only provide so much information on a PowerPoint, these are just some of the select ones. So we looked at identity-related variables, we looked at gender-based violence, HIV stigma, as well as other variables too. So we looked at descriptive statistics to report on sociodemographic variables of our sample. We used longitudinal data to conduct bivariate and multivariable analysis to examine the associations with our outcome variable, which is again being unable to access primary healthcare services. We reported odds ratios, adjusted odds ratios, and 95% confidence intervals. And for anyone that doesn't necessarily know what these mean, I will talk about it later on in our results section. And we used a p-value of less than 0.10. So anything conducted in bivariate analysis and had a p-value of less than that, we considered it statistically significant. This table just provides a snapshot of some of the select variables I've chosen, which characterize our sample of approximately of 281 women living with HIV. As you'll see, a large proportion of our cohort is made up of Indigenous women, and of those Indigenous women, 13.2% identified as Two-Spirit. And when we look at our primary outcome variable, which is kind of here at the bottom, approximately 19.6% of participants stated that they were unable to access mental health care services. Okay, so this graph that you see right here is a forest plot, and what I'm showing you is what was statistically significant in multivariable analysis. So what this means is after adjusting for all of the socio-demographic variables, these three particular socio-demographic variables remain significant. So that's being unable to access primary health care, experiencing HIV-related stigma, and experiencing gender-based violence all in the last 6 months. How you would read this particular graph, if you see this purple line here, that's the reference point. So anything that is on that line, and even if these whiskers, so the 95% confidence intervals, if it crosses that line, it is not statistically significant. And as you can tell, nothing is crossing the line, nothing's touching the line, because I'm showing you what was statistically significant. As points move up from the reference line, the likelihood of being unable to access mental health care services increases. So if you want to take, for example, the last variable at the bottom, how you would read this is women living with HIV who experienced gender-based violence in the last 6 months were more than 2 times likely to being unable to access mental health care services. So kind of onto the implications, what all of this means. Well, recent gender-based violence, HIV-related stigma, and being unable to access primary healthcare services are all barriers to accessing mental health care services amongst our participants in cohort. What we recommend is providing more trauma-informed care within mental health services. What this means, or what trauma-informed care looks like, is healthcare service workers acknowledging and recognizing that there are people that may be going through some form of violence or trauma, and providing care that is sensitive and taking into those backgrounds. Additionally, we recommend implementing some form of anti-HIV stigma and discrimination training within mental health care training. Again, mental health care mental health in general is already very stigmatized. So it's even more important to create welcoming environments where people are able and feel comfortable to ask for help when they need it. And lastly, we all live here in Canada. We know that our healthcare service and system is not the best right now. In fact, one report released in 2019 from the Canadian Mental Health Association noted that a lot of people access mental health care services through their primary healthcare service provider. So that's a family physician or a general practitioner, and our findings kind of coincide with that as well. So what we recommend is having better resources and building more capacity within our primary healthcare system, which is a lot easier said than done. And one thing I do want to note, as I mentioned beforehand, a large proportion of our participants do come from Indigenous backgrounds. So it's even more important to provide services and care that is not only culturally safe and culturally appropriate, so that people do find meaning with the help that they get and are able to improve and overcome their mental health conditions and issues. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.